The reason we celebrate International Nurses Day on the 12th of May is that this was the birth date of the most famous nurse of them all, Florence Nightingale. And I think almost everybody alive knows a little bit of the legend of the lady with the lamp and the story of how she revolutionized the nursing profession and particularly the work she did improving hygiene standards in hospitals. Perhaps fewer people know that she is also credited as being one of the first people who was able to successfully communicate statistics to the masses through her use of charts and graphs. That's a part of her story you don't hear spoken about a lot. And I'm really excited to find out more about this remarkable woman. For Book Club today, I'm delighted to welcome on the line British author Mark Bostridge, whose 2008 biography of Florence Nightingale won the prestigious Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography. Mark, we so appreciate your making time to speak to us today. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
Yours was dubbed the first major biography of Florence Nightingale in over 50 years. What was it about her story that made you want to write about her?
Partly because I knew that it hadn't been done for such a long time, and I also knew that it was very difficult to get past the legend and to see the real individual. And I mean, I was almost totally ignorant of the stature of this extraordinary woman when I started work on the book. And I was just amazed to find that she was one of the outstanding intellects of not only of her time, but really of all time. She had the most extraordinary administrative mind.
And as I mentioned in my introduction, Mark, that went well beyond the scope of a hospital setting and hygiene practices and nursing care. It was a mind that applied itself more broadly to wider society and was able to take what she'd learned in that situation and go, well, how do we use this learning to improve other parts of society? She was a woman, though, in a time when women's voices were not very loud and were not listened to very much. Mark, what was it about her character, do you think, that made her successful in arguing her points and putting forward her proposals and getting men to listen to them?
I suppose the main thing in allowing her that voice to be heard was the power of the legend that grew up around her name during the Crimean War.
Yeah.
She'd given nurses a new status, and she knew how to use that power to influence government ministers to make the sanitary and nursing, the public health reforms that were necessary. Yeah. And so there's that. There's also the fact that she was very good at expressing ideas in a very straightforward and pithy way so that people could understand them. So, I mean, one of the most important legacies, I suppose, popular legacies of Florence Nightingale is the fact that she impressed upon people in her best-selling book, Notes on Nursing in 1860, the importance of washing your hands. And, of course, that was a very important lesson that governments across the world were keen to press upon their populations during the pandemic.
Yes, of course. You know, Mark, you've referenced the Crimean War. I'm sure at least everybody listening will have some snippet of an idea of the situation she encountered there. But just to remind everybody that when she arrived at that battlefield hospital and arrived at Scutari, men were dying like flies, not only from their battlefield wounds, but in fact in greater numbers from infectious diseases. And as you say, Mark, the ground rules she implemented, the changes she insisted upon in that setting are still applied to this very day. What was her background that allowed her to experiment with those proposals and come up with those theories in the first place?
An old version of Florence Nightingale's life would have said that she went to the Crimean War, she went to Scutari and then to the Crimea itself and completely transformed the situation by herself. I mean, it's true that she and her volunteer on a small sort of band of nurses were keen on establishing the link between filth and disease. And so there was a great accent on cleaning and on making soldiers' conditions better. But really, what she learned during the Crimean War was about sanitation and the importance of proper drainage and ventilation. And this was the foundation of her work, not only for the army, but for the other parts of society when she returned from the war in 1856. But I mean, while she and her nurses made a great deal of difference in their hospitals during the Crimean War, there was the government sent out a sanitary commission in the spring of 1855, which worked with Florence Nightingale and which succeeded in reducing the death rate from 42% to 2%.
Sure. I mean, what a substantial impact. Yeah. Mark, I mentioned at the start her fascination with statistics and her love of the science of statistics, but particularly the way she had of bridging statistics to the public and making them accessible and understandable. Particularly famous, if you've not heard of the Florence Nightingale Rose diagram, go and Google it and you'll find a very famous, it's effectively a form of a pie chart, I guess, which she drew up to try and demonstrate to ordinary people, and not just ordinary people, to the royalty as well, to demonstrate the impact and the causes of death in those situations she'd come out of. Mark, I mean, is she recognised within the greater field of statistics? I mean, she sounds like she really was one of the very first to recognise we can bridge the gap and help people understand better if we just find a way of telling these stories visually.
Yes, I mean, she was the first woman member of Britain's Royal Statistical Society, and she always said that she would rather read a book of statistics than a novel. She had a great mathematical mind, which was evident from childhood. And yes, the diagram was very important because she was directing it when she came home from the Crimea at governments, trying to show that many more soldiers had died from disease than from battle wounds during the war.
Yeah.
And she wanted to impress this on their minds, and the best way of doing so was to do this extraordinary chart. I mean, she worked with William Farr, who was a great statistician, and she drew on the work of great statisticians like Playfair. But her Rose diagram really was an extraordinary illustrative way of showing to everyone the extent of the sacrifices that the army had made. And of course, in her later work, she's drawing on statistical data to work out situations for health, not only in hospitals, but in ordinary people's lives.
Yeah. And I mean, huge impact in terms of getting governments to recognise that good ventilation, that sufficient drainage and proper water systems and sanitation systems could make a difference, as you said, in people's ordinary living conditions, particularly when you think about how the poor had been living up until that point, Mark, and the changes, what she envisaged in terms of changing their lifestyle. The footprint is huge and the influence is huge. But seeing as today is specifically International Nurses Day, let's finish by bringing it back to her impact on the role of nursing in particular. I mean, when you look at her work and the impact that she made, what would you regard as her most significant contribution to the profession?
Well, I mean, as you may know, in Britain, we're having a pretty dreadful time in the way we treat nurses at the moment, because nurses have been forced to go on strike. And despite the fact that everybody in government stood up and clapped nurses during the pandemic, we're still not paying them a decent living wage. And Florence Nightingale would have been appalled by that, but not, I think, terribly surprised at the way nurses' status continues to sort of, people pay lip service to them, but don't always realise that they need to be supported because they are one of the most important components in society. I always think one of the most important things in Britain that she did for nurses generally for our health service is that during the latter part of her working life, she introduced trained nurses into workhouses, which meant in practice that these terrible places of degradation normally have previously sick paupers had been looked after by other paupers. And what Florence Nightingale did was introduce trained nurses into the workhouses so they received proper treatment, proper nursing. And this really announces the principle that is still alive in our National Health Service, that however little money you have, you still have a right to proper health care. And I think that's one of the most important principles that she established.
Absolutely. Mark, at the start of this conversation, our listener Sandy recalled having been working at St Thomas's Hospital in London in the 60s when the statue of Florence Nightingale was stolen. Do you happen to know whether it was ever returned or replaced?
Yes, it was returned. I mean, I can't quite think where it is at the moment, because when I started working on my book in the 1990s, it was actually at the front of St. Thomas's. I think it's now inside.
Okay.
But yes, it has been returned. And of course, there's another famous statue of Florence Nightingale near in Pall Mall, which people will be putting flowers by today.
Today, no doubt. Mark, it's been wonderful having you on the show today. I know, and thank you particularly, because this is talking about a book that is quite long in your past already. As a matter of interest, are there any new biographies or other works in the works?
Well, I'm in Britain, biography isn't really fashionable anymore, so I'm writing a book which is a sort of story about a woman who was Victor Hugo's younger daughter, who ran after a British soldier across the world and went mad. And it's a story that tries to link her experience with mine in rather a strange way. You have to look for new ways of writing these things, rather these very long books based on a lot of documentation, which people don't necessarily have the time to read.
It sounds intriguing. Can't wait to read it. Mark Bostridge, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Mark is the author of Florence Nightingale, The Woman and Her Legend, and it is still available on many of the online sales platforms. So if you are fascinated by some of the story he's just shared with us, or would like to know more about her story, it is an excellent biography. It was an award-winning biography when it came out. You can still find it on stores like Takealot and Amazon. Mark Bostridge, Florence Nightingale, The Woman and Her Legend.